Hi everyone, this is Cathode Bias episode 9, and this is Chris. Back here in Lake Tahoe, Nevada, up in the High Sierra. It's a crisp spring day and I'm out in the garage. But I wanted to come out here today to talk a little bit about a couple pieces I worked on last year that I currently have up for sale. Both from Dynaco, a Dynaco PAS 2 preamp, which you see in front of you, and also a Dynaco ST-70, which I will go through in just a minute. I bought these pieces separately. One I got from a Lockheed engineer, this ST-70. He had done quite a bit of work on it, and I went through it and cleaned up a few things on it. And this piece I bought from the original owner, whose father had passed away, and this one was in pretty much original condition when I got it. And yeah, so like a lot of pieces from the 60s, if you're looking at vintage tube amplifiers or vintage preamplifiers like this one, the chances that they're going to work reliably as soon as you acquire it, if they haven't been previously worked on, is pretty unlikely. And there's a few reasons. The primary reason is that these older amplifiers, and actually modern amplifiers as well, use electrolytic capacitors. And electrolytic capacitors dry out over a period of time, and they will basically lead to an open circuit and cause all kinds of problems with the amplifier when they go bad. And almost every amplifier I pick up in original condition, I find that I have to redo the power supply and the electrolytic capacitors in the power supply, which is what I did here. A couple of things you'll note right away when you, if the electrolytic capacitors are bad, these are called filter caps in the power supply. When they go bad, what you'll hear is a hum a lot of times. And secondarily, you might not just have a lot of dynamics in the system. This might sound really flat. Those are both very characteristic problems with bad filter caps or electrolytic caps in the power supply. So what I did here is I followed some advice from D-Lab Electronics, which is another YouTube channel, on the PAS 2 on upgrading the power supply. He recommended ordering a board directly from Triode Electronics that replaces pretty much the entire power supply with one piece that you basically assemble and then put into the unit. And that's this piece right here. These are about $100. I think they've gone up recently. When I purchased this, it came with all the components. I think they're just selling the board now separately. I think which would increase the cost of these. So let's say maybe with the new components and the board, probably maybe $150 or less. So it gives you an idea of sort of the cost there of doing this project without labor. The other thing that this upgrade does is it brings a fuse into the circuit, which surprisingly the ST or the PAS 2 or any of the PAS 2, PAS 3 does not have fuses, which if you ever have a short in the system could pretty much be A, dangerous, B, also take out other components in the system and cause a lot of problems. So I think it's a good idea that they add this fuse into the wall power, the power coming out of the wall before it goes into the actual power supply of the amplifier. This isn't a super hard upgrade. I'd say maybe this is about a 3-hour upgrade. If you've done it before, I've done it twice. I have a couple of these PAS units. The second one went a little bit smoother, but there's a couple gotchas on it. One is there's quite a bit of wiring you have to do underneath the chassis into this board, and it's kind of finicky to get the wires lined up underneath. Some people actually wire them in up top, which I thought that was kind of ugly. I'd rather have all the wiring hidden underneath the board, which this one does. I think it's a lot more clean, but it's also finicky to actually get wired up that way. The second sort of gotcha is the directions aren't super clear of how to actually wire it up, and you have to basically, I had to basically look at the PAS 2 schematic and compare that with the directions and kind of figure out how everything worked. I mean, it wasn't rocket science, but it took me maybe an hour or two to figure out exactly how to wire this up and make sure the board was wired in correctly. The last thing you want to do is wire this incorrectly. So, and cause even more problems with your system. So like this is wired incorrectly now, and the system is functioning really well. So what this does is it replaces a rectifier here, a green rectifier, and 2 capacitors in the power supply that were directly underneath this. You just pull those all out and you put this board in there. It also replaces this cap can here, and then optionally you can replace this this tube rectifier tube here, but I decided to leave this tube rectifier in just to keep the circuit more original. I kind of like the look of it internally, having the tube there. I also left this cap can in place, even though it doesn't do anything. If you looked at my last video, I would say like replacing these capacitor cans is almost always necessary in these old units, and in this case it was as well, except for instead of putting another cap can, I put in these replacement capacitors here on top of the chassis. So basically a couple of notes here is like the reason why I think it's important to replace the selenium rectifier, which is the green square that's in here, is they're almost, they can commonly go bad, and they're also toxic. So when they do go bad, they can release a toxin into the air, which is bad and can be potentially unhealthy. And when if they do go bad, they can cause other problems, like the impedance can go up, the impedance can change over time. You know, it cause other sort of problems with the system. So I think it's always best, and I always just remove them. That was the advice I got on some of the forums when I first started this, and I just follow that advice. Almost every system I work on, remove the selenium rectifiers if they have them. Not all systems have selenium rectifiers. Some of them are rectifiers that are solid state at all. A lot of them can use just a tube, like the X101B that I looked at last week. With the rest of the board, this is the preamp board. I left everything 100% original in here. You can go in here and recap this as well, which is what I did with another PAS that I have. But this one was working well and is sounding good. And a lot of people claim that the tone of the preamplifier comes from these original capacitors. These ones are General Instrument. Generally, they're pretty high quality capacitors and don't really go bad that often. So I decided just to leave them. This is the phono section over here. It's got a very good sounding phono section. Again, it was sounding good, and I tested a few of the values in here, and they all look good. And so I decided to just leave it alone and not replace any of the actual driver boards. And again, I think D-Lab Electronics recommends the same thing. You know, the primary thing you really need to focus on is the power supply. Almost all these systems have electrical caps. They go dry out, they go bad, you have to replace them. It's very common, so that's what's done here on this system. The other thing I put in some new tubes in here. I think I paid $10 or $12 each for these tubes, but I looked recently. If you can find these tubes, which are almost impossible following the war in the Ukraine, New Sensor is not exporting tubes at all, and these are made by New Sensor from Russia, and it's caused a huge run on vacuum tubes across the industry. It's very hard to find tubes. I found a couple of these actually that could buy maybe 4 of them at a time, and they were $50 each. So the cost of these tubes alone is $200 now. There's over $200 in preamp tubes, 12AX7 tubes here. And this tube here is a little more common. They don't make them anymore, but you can find them new old stock pretty easily. These are still, relatively inexpensive. But 12AX7s, which are real common, they're common in guitar amps, they're common in preamps, they're common in lots of amplifiers, are super hard to find right now. This amplifier is going to come with it. So just think of that. When you buy this amplifier, you're getting $200 in just tubes, $150 here in parts here. So you're talking about just the upgrades I did. My cost alone is $400 almost, and just just parts on this. And then the labor I did, maybe a half day to try to wire this in, and then the testing, basically testing the voltages on this, and also testing it with my scope to make sure everything was working properly. This thing is ready to go. I totally trust it. I believe it'd be good for, even with these tubes, you probably won't have to replace these tubes for, who knows, maybe another 10 years. And depending on how heavily you use it, these newer tubes maybe aren't as reliable as some of the vintage tubes like the Telefunctions. But this is a really good sounding amplifier, preamplifier. The one thing you have to keep in mind is you cannot use these with solid state amplifiers. You have to use it with a tube amplifier, and the reason why is because the impedance that basically is presented by the tube amplifier is much higher than a solid state amplifier, and that actually completes the tone circuit. These preamps don't have something called a cathode follower, which other preamps like the Marantz, Macintoshes do. So actually the tone controls are actually affected by the amplifier you have connected to it. So if you connect this to a solid state amplifier, it will not sound right. I'm warning you right now. You cannot connect this without making modifications to a solid state amplifier. You have to use a tube amplifier, and I recommend the ST-70. That's why I'm selling these as a pair. I'm selling this amplifier, the preamplifier, along with the ST-70. We're selling them as a pair. Again, yeah, really happy with this way this came out. This is a nice, clean upgrade. You can tell the interior of this is very clean as well. I'd say the physical chassis is probably an 8 out of 10 overall, but the interior is extremely clean, and this system works really well now. And yeah, hopefully you can find a new home for it, and I'll show you the ST-70 in just a second. Okay, we're back, and now we have the Dynaco ST-70 up on the bench here. So I'm going to show the top of this unit first, and then we'll go into what's underneath it and what's been done underneath. So these are really kind of a classic push-pull vintage tube amplifier. These are really popular, real common. They're fairly easy to work on, and there's a lot of parts available for these things. I really highly recommend these as maybe your first tube amp. These used to be really easy to come by and fairly inexpensive, but the prices have gone up quite a bit on these. And as I mentioned before, tube prices have gone absolutely nuts. There's probably close to $500 worth of tubes in this system right now. And I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail in just a second. So I want to talk a little bit about the work that's been done on this one, and then on the top, and then we'll go underneath it. So the most important thing to look at right now is right up here. This is the driver board, to the preamp driver board of the ST-70. This says is where your coupling caps are, where basically different sections of the amplifier are connected together with capacitors. A lot of times these can be left the same, and I bought this amplifier, like I mentioned in the last video, from an engineer who had gone through this himself, and I basically kept it alone, kept the work he had done on it, and just basically made one repair to it. But you can see all these coupling caps here have been replaced. Looks like with orange drop type capacitors. And it looks like they're exactly to the original spec. Sometimes you can increase the capacitance on these. I did follow another amplifier I worked on, is ST-70. I did the work myself. I did follow some recommendations by Dynaco sort of experts to sort of up spec some of the capacitors. But this one is this basically the circuit is 100% original. It just has had some components replaced in it, but there's no changes to the circuit at all. Again, if you see my last video, you'll know these are important to replace. This is the electrolytic capacitor for the filter caps for this amplifier. These are almost always bad. This one's been replaced. Fortunately, these are fairly available. These are about $50 right now. I think you can buy them in multiple different places. This is made by CE Manufacturing. These are good quality capacitors. I think they're made with tooling, vintage tooling actually, and very similar to the vintage capacitors that came in these. I've put these in a few different systems with no problems at all. Highly recommend them. And they work great. And so this one has the CE capacitor here. I'll show you how it's hooked up underneath in just a second. Really, the only other thing to talk about up here is the tubes, for instance. These are the EL 34 output tubes. This doesn't have a match set in it. It doesn't really matter. You can, as long as these two are the same, these two are the same, you can set the bias independently. It doesn't matter as long as these two are the match and these two are matched. I will put in 100% matched set of tubes in this, so you'll have basically a brand new set of matched tubes in here. It doesn't really matter for this amplifier because you can set the bias on each channel individually, but I will do that anyways, just so the buyer is satisfied with the purchase. And again, these tubes right now, like prices, if you can find these tubes, which are very hard to find, these are actually made in Russia. These are made, I think, in Slovakia. Are over a set of 4 is over $200. Again, you could have bought these for less than 100, around 100 just a couple weeks ago. Prices on tubes have gone absolutely nuts. I'm really hoping Western Electric can bring on some production in the U.S. and alleviate some of the problems that we're having out there. This is actually a really nice rectifier tube. There are modifications to remove this, but I decided to leave it in the circuit. These were, I don't know what these are currently going for, but that was a $35 tube just itself. If there is one major drawback with the ST-70 is it uses 7199, which even previous to the Ukrainian war, were not being produced anywhere. So you basically have to get new old stock, and these are very expensive tubes. These are RCA vintage tubes. They sound great, but they're also very expensive to replace. You'll get a good set with this system, probably these RCAs that are in there right now. But these were selling for $200 last year. I don't even want to know what they're selling for right now. So I would estimate you got about $450 to $500 worth of tubes in here. it's crazy. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that's what the value of the tubes are. But please keep in mind when you look at the prices on vintage gear, if they have new tubes in it or they have good tubes, just think about the price of replacing it. That's why I have to price these at the price I'm pricing it, which is about $1,800 for the set right now. So the only other thing on the top, I don't know if you can really see it here. You probably can't. And I'll post some pictures in the listing, is that it has modern speaker bindings for banana posts. They are connected to the 8 ohm taps. If you have speakers that aren't 8 ohms, that are either, I think, 4 or 16 ohms, this also supports those. I can change these. 8 ohms are obviously the most common speaker impedance, so I basically just left them at the 8 ohm configuration. These are actually really nice for connecting modern banana plugs into this amplifier. Again, so up top, what you got here, new sets of tubes, some nice vintage driver tubes, 7199s, and you got these coupling capacitors all been replaced on the top of this chassis, and also the important filter cap here. So I'm going to flip this over and we'll talk about some of the wiring underneath. Okay, so now we're looking at the underside of the ST-70 chassis. Here's the driver board that I mentioned before. Here's the transformer. Here is the filter cap, the cap can, and here's the output tubes, and here's the rectifier tube. So basically 3 modifications have been made underneath. One is you have to basically go under 3 or 4. Let's call it 4. Underneath, you have to go underneath here and basically add those coupling, those orange caps that are on top through the bottom of this. It's very difficult to work on these old boards. Like, this is one of the original boards. These traces can lift up very easily. It looks like one of them may have lifted up here, and there's a small repair here, but it looks like it's very solid contact, and maybe a small repair there. The repairs on the board look very good, though, and it has otherwise the original printed circuit board in this unit. This one looks like it was probably built, a lot of these were, as a it looks like it was built as a kit, because the wiring is a lot of red wiring here. I think if you were to see a wire from the factory, you'd see more different colored wiring in here. But this one seems to be, yeah, it looks like they used a similar color wiring all over the place in here. Don't know why. Doesn't affect anything. It's just kind of like, if you're looking at pictures of it, you might be looking for a blue wire, and it might be red in this unit. Okay, so that was one thing. Okay, we had to go underneath here to replace those coupling capacitors. Kind of some of the more important things. This is where the selenium rectifier in this unit is. Just like the PAS, the ST-70 also has a selenium rectifier. There's where it was mounted to. This might actually be the rectifier here, but it's taken out of the circuit, and instead it's he added in the previous owner added in a basically a what do you call it, standoff, basically terminal strip where you could add in this diode into the system. So it's like a 10-cent part, but these make a big difference. I would highly recommend, if you're looking at ST-70s, ask if it has the original rectifier, if the diode's been put in there. It doesn't take long to do this. This is probably like a 20-minute mod, but it's really important to the stability of the ST-70 overall. And my other ST-70 did exactly the same upgrade. So that was the second thing that's been done. The third thing, again, is the capacitor can. Again, here's how it's wired in. There's a lot of high voltage in here. Oh, one thing I didn't mention is this board is live. So when you're looking at the top of this unit, be very careful. There is hundreds of volts going through one of these units. I actually got a shock off one of these years and years ago. Accidentally touched one when it was live. I haven't made that mistake twice, honestly. But you have to keep in mind, on the top of this unit, it's a live unit. They don't make them like that anymore. It's pretty crazy that you could have a live circuit. This one does come with the cage, so if you have kids or something and you don't want them touching it, just put the cage on top. And you can't look at the tubes, you can't see some of the inner workings of it, but it's a lot safer for operation. So here, again, the cap can is here. It's wired in. High voltages coming out of the power transformer into this cap can. Super important upgrade on this system. There are 2 other electrical capacitors over here that need to be replaced. This is in the bias supply of the ST-70. This is another one. If you're going to work on one of these, like, almost always have to replace these. These are electrical capacitors. I replace these on my unit as well, that I worked on myself. This is where I did make a repair. This a solder joint had gone bad. I went back and fixed it. I think it's pretty solid now. I don't think that's going anywhere. Again, these capacitors and the bias supply have to be replaced, and they've been replaced on this unit. So that's kind of it underneath the ST-70. These are pretty easy to work on, quite frankly. That's why I recommend these as kind of like a first vintage tube amp to buy. A lot easier to work on than, say, a Fisher, which has got kind of a rat nest underneath. A lot of the wiring is already pre-done for you as part of these circuit boards. The drawback of the circuit boards is they're very fragile, but they can be replaced as well. Like almost everything in these systems can be replaced. That's kind of all that's been done on this one. Like, again, the only other thing is like the speaker binding posts, if you can see them, have been added on here. That's I think a nice convenience if you want to use banana plugs on this amplifier. I'll list all the voltages out. There is in the schematic, there is a list of voltages to check on this. I will double check to make sure all the voltages are in spec, and I will send you those specs as well. And in the last part of this video, I'll show you how to bias this amp, and which anyone can do as long as you have a voltmeter. And this amp's good to go. And again, it'll be sold with that PAS 2 that I showed earlier. Those two will be sold as a single unit. Hi all, so I'm back. I have this amplifier fired up now to about 125 volts coming into it, which is very common for wall socket power these days, which has kind of come up since this amplifier was first built in the 1960s. It was more close to probably 115, but I am testing at sort of modern voltages of like 125. And I do have some resistors hooked up to basically mock a load for the speakers connected to the speaker terminals. You can just basically connect your speakers to do this. Okay, so I'm going to basically show you how to bias this. And basically, that's basically setting the voltages that goes to the output tube. Some amplifiers, it's very hard to, kind of a pain in the ass to do this. And part of the name of this site is cathode bias. That's one strategy to do it, but it involves basically measuring the drop in voltage across the resistor. In this case, you don't have to do anything complicated at all to measure the bias. Basically, all you do is you take a voltmeter, and this is a fairly inexpensive one that I got. It's a Kaiweets. These are about 35 bucks, but any voltmeter will do the trick as long as you can measure DC voltage with it. And I've got like the black ground lead from it, and all I'm going to do is basically put it into any kind of hole on the chassis, so it's grounded to the chassis. And then I've got the positive lead. Now I got to be a little bit careful here because remember this top of this board's live, and then put it into, like it says bias set here. Just stick it into that hole that says bias set on the front of it, right? That's all you got to do. And then start reading the voltages. It's got 1.76. And this one should be set to 1.56. So all I'm going to do, I'm using the plastic again so I don't short anything out on the top of this, is turn this pot on the top of it down until it gets to 1.56. So it's going down, very close. Okay, we're basically maybe just a tad bit more, and that's probably close enough, but we'll just, yeah, there we go. So this was basically completely biased in right now, dead on, right? So very simple to do. And this is why you don't have to have matched tubes in here. You can just basically have each channel match on each side, and you're fine. So yeah, I will send a set of matched tubes, all four, but this way it's set up right now with two sets of different tubes is actually fine. So now I'm going to do actually the other side, the right side, and so go again, bias set. Let's see what this one's reading. This one's reading a little bit high, 1.8. Same thing, just going to turn this pot right here down until I get down 1.56. And getting close. You barely turn this thing, maybe just even a quarter turn is enough. And we're basically there. And that's it. That's how easy it is to bias these. Fishers and some other amplifiers that do use cathode bias, like the name of this website, and much more. Some of them use fixed bias. That's also complicated to bias. And then basically you have to check it manually underneath the chassis every time you change tubes. Nice thing about the Dynaco, especially if you're a first-time tube amp owner, super simple to bias these things, right? And you can say this runs pretty stable. It's kind of staying on the 0.56, 0.55, close enough. That's about, yeah, that's what you need to do here. And if you have any questions or comments on how to bias this and you're interested in purchasing this product, I'll more than be glad to help you out. And yeah, that's all I've got. And if you're interested, let me know. You can DM me on Instagram, and I'll put a link to some more information in the description of this video. And I also will test all the voltages on this and also make sure they're in spec and report on those as well before I finalize the sale on this unit. So ST-70 PAS 2, $1,800, all new tubes. Again, we've got almost $700 worth of tubes, maybe more in these units. That's a good chunk of the cost right there. These units are very stable and ready to run right now. And if you're looking to get into vintage hi-fi, it's a good place to start. And we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.